Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Callan Steinman. I'm Curator of Education at the Georgia Museum of Art. I'm excited to welcome you to today's Zoom program, a curator talk with Dr. Shawnya Harris, who is our Larry D. and Brenda A. Thompson Curator of African American and African Diasporic Art. Dr. Harris will be speaking us today about her current exhibition, an in dialogue installation, Artist, Mentor, Friend, Ronald Locket and Thornton Dial Sr.
Thanks, Callan. Welcome everyone for coming today to our In Dialogue mini talk with two works that are in our permanent collection wing and are actually a part of our permanent collection. As you might be aware of from previous presentations, In Dialogue is kind of a series of kind of mini exhibitions where we feature maybe a work from our permanent collection alongside either other works from our permanent collection or other works from other institutions to kind of discuss a topic or a theme, or to present and compare or contrast different works of art in a newer way that we wouldn't normally be able to do in our permanent wing in other occasions, or they might be a small grouping of works that might not be included in a larger exhibition, but something that we wanted to focus on and create a conversation around. What I decided to focus on for my In Dialogue installation were two works by very well-known at this point in history, self-taught artist, Ronald Locket and Thornton Dial Sr. And ironically, both works of art they're both in our permanent collection, and they're both donated to our museum out of the generosity of our loyal patrons, Ronald and June Shelp, who have an extensive collection of self-taught, some people call it outsider or folk art, in their home, and we're grateful to them for these gifts that they've given to us over the years, among others, of self-taught artists. Ronald Locket and Thornton Dial Sr. Are both important within the context of, see if I can click to the next slide. So let me, hold on a second. I'm a bit frozen here. Take one brief second. Okay, I froze up a little bit there, I apologize. So as you can see, both Ronald Locket and Thornton Dial Sr. are both deceased. Thornton Dial Sr., ironically, just a few years ago in 2016, Ronald Locket at a very young age in 1998, but both had parallel running careers, with Thornton Dial probably being the more notable, having achieved a lot more fame earlier in his career as an artist. Both artists lived in Bessemer, Alabama, which was outside of Birmingham, but also kind of a I would say a post-industrial or post-manufacturing city where a lot of industry occurred. Thornton Dial Sr. Worked for the Pullman Standard Company, which was responsible for creating rail cars ever since the late 19th and early 20th century, which employed a lot of individuals, including African Americans. Ronald Locket was, by and large, an artist his entire life. He didn't live as long as Thornton Dial, so he didn't have the change in careers or extension of careers that Dial Sr. had, but they both were cousins, and the junior one of the two, Ronald Locket, pretty much looked up to Dial as he progressed in his artistic career. And you can kind of see some similarities in how they kind of express their relationship to their community, to the way that they looked at the world, but also the way in which they differed in terms of their materials, as well as the way in which they kind of formulated their own kind of particular aesthetic. So I just put this little collage of images together just to kind of give you a sense of the fact that both artists were a part of a kind of a constellation of influences that appear in their work, but also what were happening around them. You could argue that Thornton Dial Sr. was, by the date that he was born, a Depression era individual. So he was born during the Depression era, but he was also born, he came of age during the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of those, he's also would be a part of a discussion about the influence of the Great Migration. Although he remained in the South, when you think of things like Pullman Standard Company, and you think of a transportation, a lot of which fueled industry in northern cities, Thornton Dial was kind of coming after that period of lots of changes that would occur with African Americans, whether it be migration, whether it be civil rights, and that would have influenced how he saw himself as both an artist, but also as a man living in Alabama. Someone like Ronald Locket would be considered a part of the era that followed that kind of civil rights movement. Also kind of a post-industrial era where many of the manufacturing plants and the industry, the steel industry was strong in parts of Alabama and mining. Many of those industries would have disappeared when he came of age in Alabama. And so you begin to see kind of the decline that he would have experienced and would have impacted how he saw the world as a young man coming of age and reaching adulthood and experiencing adulthood in Bessemer, Alabama. One individual that would have impacted the work of both artists, but primarily Dial in the beginning, was the collector Bill Arnett, who recently passed away. Arnett was a prominent collector, founder of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which has supported many self-taught artists. He collected thousands and thousands of works. Several of those works have now been donated to various institutions around the country to promote awareness about self-taught artists like Dial and Locket, as well as supporting those artists in their individual communities. Many artists like Locket and Dial, primarily operated in parts of the South that were largely rural and largely impoverished. So the support that they received from collectors like Arnett and even our generous benefactors, the Shelps, would have been able to not only mobilize their careers, but also help to support their families, as with any other artist who primarily live off of their work. So to the left, you just see an image of Arnett in the early days with a cluster of various works by Thornton Dial, and then the two talking in a later period. So as I mentioned earlier, Thornton Dial has been the subject of several solo as well as group exhibitions around self-taught art. This is another important exhibition that occurred in 2018. History Refused to Die, highlights from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation gift at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So with such notoriety, we see works such as these entering into prominent collections. And it does kind of raise the question about what are the influences and what are the important aspects to think about in terms of their creation. So the first work that I'll talk about today that was included in our In Dialogue presentation is one called Food Line, which was created in 2008. And it's an assemblage piece. It's first painted, you can kind of tell that it's painted this reddish or various shades of red or kind of maroon and orange, maybe even a little bit of gray onto a plywood surface. But also there's this kind of crumply material that you might note. And that crumply material is the backing that you may find on carpeting. So if you can kind of think about carpeting as being an industrially produced item that we use for our homes to, you know, give it aesthetic beauty, but also comfort for our feet. And Dial translates this, he reverses what we would normally expect to see of the of carpeting and takes us, if you will, to the bare bones of the backing of the carpeting, and he paints it in this elaborate, very textured surface, but it also looks like it's deteriorating. And he calls it Food Line. And if you think about food lines, and if you look at images from the news, you know, you often see people encircling a building or encircling a center where they can receive food. Dial kind of approximates an S shape or a kind of serpentine shape here in the composition. And these crumpled surfaces kind of, you know, remind us of these kind of lumpen masses of people that if from a distance, if we saw them, we couldn't really make out their individual features. They just become lumpen masses. And with this, he sort of makes a commentary on how we view people that are kind of nameless, faceless people that are often impoverished, whether they be in his own community of Bessemer, Alabama, or if they are in other inner city images that we might make note of. And just kind of to provide a little bit of historical context, the whole notion of, you know, the food line or our images of it, you know, vary over time. But the critique is usually largely the same, that society often has more people who are impoverished, who are hungry, than can be managed or can be valued and preserved. This is an image, a famous image from Life magazine from the Depression era by Margaret Bork-White, a photographer. It's been called Louisville Flood, or probably more popularly, the world's highest standard of living, based on the background or the billboard that is behind this group of African Americans, no doubt, who are standing in the food line during the Depression era, waiting to get food. And so it's not clear whether Dial might have seen an image like this or remembered seeing an image like this, but I'm sure, you know, because they abound in all forms of media, he may have been thinking about these lines or these images of people who were hungry. And in this case, he makes them, you know, pretty anonymous. He abstracts them out with this material of the carpet backing. The other thing that Dial likes to do with many of his works, I mean, he has an assortment of found objects that would be used, maybe rope, twigs, so elements from nature, but also elements from the man-made world that are adhered to a surface, like you would see in Food Line, and painted with thick layers of paint, and they become kind of symbolic of a kind of human presence, or the presence of human industry, if you will, or human activity. This just to give you another visual. This is Blood and Meat, Survival for the World. Again, another social commentary on hunger, on poverty, and so forth. And he makes the quote when he's talking about these types of works, that when I went to making art on plywood, I drawed it out first with a pencil, and after that, I put on the other materials, stuff I find or stuff I have, like the steel, carpet, and old tin, and then I paint it. But under all those things, I did a big drawing to guide what I put on top of it. So he does have a strategy that he utilizes. It's not simply abstracted, materials kind of being assembled. He has a thought and an idea about how he wants to kind of outline a narrative, if you will, about what he's trying to say. And this particular work, by the way, if you can kind of make note of it, you can see the evidence of some faces underneath. So there is, again, this kind of general outline, and then he creates more of a three-dimensional feel that, kind of projects out to the viewer through the use of rope or scraps of metal, scraps of wire, other types of things to really kind of, if you will, get in your face a little bit more, as opposed to a more traditional painting where it's a flattened surface. So this is kind of a technique that Dial utilized with much of his work in this vein in the early 90s, when he really became, really got into a full-time production as an artist. So just to give you an idea about Ronald Locket, this is just kind of splash of images that would have appeared in a show that was local to this area in nearby Atlanta at the High Museum that traveled to Chapel Hill, called Ronald Locket, The Fever Within, from 2016, 2017, that featured the work of that artist. And you can tell a lot of, a big difference than Dial in some senses. But a connection to Dial nonetheless. And here's just a quote. I don't think I'll be here when I'm 60, so I want to prove to people that I can succeed in what my dream was. And as mentioned, Lockett died pretty young. He died of complications from HIV. And so he didn't really have the long range perspective that Dial, his older cousin, had when it came to the world. But by following him and learning from him and the family that was around the two of them in the area that they called Pipe Shop, which was on 15th Street in Bessemer, people described him as being pretty much a settled individual, or an individual who's very mature for his age. He followed around older individuals like Dial rather than necessarily hanging out with individuals that were of his own age range. And you can kind of see, even in his work, this kind of notion of collecting things that had a past life, or at least appreciating them and reappropriating them in much the same way that his cousin Thornton also did. This particular work is drawn from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. It was a gift of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, called The Enemy Amongst Us. And so again, there's a sort of a subtext of a critique about, or a kind of an embattled feeling, whether it be embattled by societal ills like poverty, or just a general feeling of vulnerability that comes through in some of his works. If you think, if you look at the materials for a work like this, you have painted metal and wooden surfaces, old discarded metal. You think about the steel industry or the mining industry, you think of precious metals that were turned into, that were used in industry to make various products, to make architectural structures, but now they have been discarded, now they're being thrown away. And just to kind of give you a sense of where Lockett's work began, this is an earlier work called Rebirth, and he actually created smaller mixed media works, maybe more painterly surfaces than a work like we just saw, but still there's this sense of kind of deterioration, or the sense of, you see skeletal images of animals, largely deer or bison. It makes you think of maybe the past, or almost like a prehistoric type of feeling of things that are now long gone, but we have a remnant of it. So this whole idea of using remnants and kind of breathing life back into them to understand or get a sense of history, a sense of society, a sense of the the vulnerability that is associated with the passing of time, but also the opportunity to relive some of those ideas in compositions like this. So you move from a composition like Rebirth to compositions like the previous one, and this one that we have included in our dialogue display called Undiscovered. And even the titles kind of get you thinking about, whether it be the past, or whether it be some kind of, undisclosed secret that we're learning about, under-recognized or under-discussed type of imagery. And with this particular work, he uses rusted tin, as he had in this work, The Enemy Amongst Us. And you can see that they were done only 2 years apart. And so in the early 90s, you would say that Ronald Locket largely came into his own. Thornton Dial Sr. had lived in the same neighborhood with him for a long, from his upbringing, but he had moved away and acquired a home elsewhere outside of the street that they lived on. And so these works, these rusted tin works that Locket produced, become a part of his maturing as an artist and developing his own style. So Undiscovered is a part of that kind of mature phase of Lockett's career, where he uses just the simple material of tin, sometimes painted, as you saw in the earlier work, but sometimes not, just using the natural patina of the rust, that orangish patina. And a lot of the tin was actually sourced from areas around the neighborhood, and in particular, an old barn or shed that Thornton Dial Sr. had, that he was able to acquire that material and kind of remake it into works of art. So if you ever see pictures of Locket with some of these works, you'll see him standing in front of what looks like an old shed, and that would have possibly been the shed, or would have been the shed that Thornton Dial would use as his studio and workspace area, and often he would source materials from. If you can kind of make out, what's interesting about these works, I mentioned the deer and the bison or buffalo, these kind of endangered animals that show up, and they're usually singular. They're usually not in groups. They're isolated. They show up in kind of, very elusive ways in these rusted tin constructions. So with this, he actually uses these kind of, like these pinholes to create a shape for the animal. You can see the antlers here. So it must be some type of antelope or deer in some cases. Sometimes it's buffalo. You can make out an outline of the face, even an eye. And it's amazing how he's able to use the surface of the material, the natural surface of the material, to give you these senses of volume in certain areas. So where there's bulges, you may see a bulge of the face. Where there are indentations or impressions, you may get a little bit of contour to the body of the animal, or through that sense of from those indentations. In addition, he would use scraps, other metal scraps that he found of tin, and he would attach them with nails and create these kind of steps, if you will, or different type or rock formations, or he might layer the body of the animal to give it, again, a more voluminous sensibility by attaching additional strips of metal. And this gives you a better indication of what I mean with the very narrow strips of tin that are nailed on or attached and affixed with very small nails that give you a sense of the body and the face. So like Dial, it's largely abstracted, but there's always a reference to animals or people or living things in these compositions. So it leaves no doubt that even in the midst of these kind of inanimate objects, you have representational images that if you look close enough, you're able to detect in works such as these. And this is yet another type of work that Lockett produced close to his death, as a matter of fact. And this is called Sarah Lockett's Roses. And this is a part of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation collection. And this one's a little bit different. It still incorporates the rusted tin material, but with these, he does more painting. And you can see he's proudly displaying it. And one of the reasons why is, as referenced from the title, Sarah Dial Lockett was his great aunt, also an aunt of Thornton Dial. And Sarah Lockett raised Ronald Locket in her home, and she lived to be 105 years old. And this would have been a kind of a memorial for the artist's great aunt. In some cases, she might have been seen as a motherly figure to him, or a mother, in fact, in raising him. And so he has given her flowers, if you will, maybe not while she was alive, but after her death. When you look at these surfaces here, where there's little sheets of tin that were shaped as in a floral arrangement and very colorful. It also might make one think of something else when you see these kind of blocks of color and these different patterns that are produced through these blocks of color. And I'm just putting up a little image of quilts just to get you thinking, because the area that Sarah Dial Lockett was a prolific quilter. And so Ronald Locket would have seen her quilting frequently in her home, and would have observed her passion for that particular art form and incorporated that sensibility into her work. And it also reminds us of the legacy of quilting in the South, in particular in Alabama, when you think about the Gee's Bend quilters and other quilters throughout the South, of this kind of block strip quilting and patterning, where one takes fragments from previously used cloth. In his case, he's using previously used metal and designing, if you will, something new and something that becomes a family memory or encloses family memories and recollections. So if you kind of put the two works together, just kind of as a final meditation, both artists, Thornton Dial and Ronald Locket, created works that allowed them to comb their own memories, comb the materials that were in their communities that were often discarded, that were often overlooked or as being used, as not having any value, and investing value back into them through the process of art making. And in many ways, the art making became a metaphor for their own lives, of trying to take the pieces of their lives, whether it be their the parts of the community that were forgotten, the parts of the community that were often overlooked, and trying to repiece it together into something that held a type of aesthetic beauty, but also a way of expressing their frustrations, their vulnerabilities, but also the kind of dreams and passions that they might have through their work. So if anyone has any questions, I will try to answer them the best way that I can. As with anything, I only know so much about some of the artists' lives, but I will try to answer any questions that you have to the best of my ability.
Thank you so much, Shawnya. That was wonderful. And again, I'll just remind everybody, if you have questions for Shawnya, to please put those in the Q&A box and I'll help moderate those. I have a question, Shawnya, about your process of, I know that with this In Dialogue installation, the curators at the museum are sort of taking it in turn to decide a topic for each of the installations. How did you decide on these two artists?
Well, as I might have mentioned at the beginning, actually the work on the left by Ronald Locket, we acquired it, I guess, right before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I really like that work. I mean, from the moment it, from the moment it arrived, I was like, wow, I can't wait to show this work, but I'm trying to figure out a context where, I can show it. I don't want to, minimize it by putting it in a show and it not really being able to be brought out. And then I was trying to figure out what I wanted to juxtapose it with. And, you can imagine, there's thousands of objects in the collection. And then I just thought about Thornton Dial. We had actually acquired some works by Thornton Dial that people will see in a few weeks. There are works on paper. And, I thought about the relationship between the two artists. And I was like, I don't think that these two really work together. I need something else by Thornton Dial. And so I went to storage and I was like, I saw a list in on our inventory. And I said, well, I'm not sure, what we have. And then I just happened to see this work and I was like, this work is great, the work on the right. And I realized that they were, it was also donated by the shelves. And I was like, well, isn't this uncanny? Two works that I can show together were both donated by the same person or people. And then I looked at the palette, the reds and the oranges and the grays. And I was like, wow, this would really pop on the wall. And it really did. So some of it was more intuitive on my part, rather than it being kind of a long, drawn out process. It was just kind of mining the collection and trying to identify works that I felt would work well and kind of speaking to one another.
Yeah, they work so well together. And like you said, on the wall with that sort of gray background, they really do pop. And it's really interesting to look at each of them individually, and a nice chance to kind of spotlight both of the artists in these works, but seeing them in dialogue with one another, it's a really nice juxtaposition.
And I think that the other part of it is the works were not that, I mean, I would say that Dial produced his work, maybe I guess it was about a decade after Lockett would have passed away. And I often wonder if he thought about Lockett when he produced the work, so, I mean, not that he would have seen necessarily used it based on, created it based on this work, but I often wonder if he thought about some of their conversations and interaction when he produced his work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a couple of other questions in the Q&A. The first is from Azalea, who asked, what is your favorite piece? And I don't know if, Azalea, if you mean of the two of these or of the whole collection at the museum. I guess, Shawnya, I'll leave that open to interpretation, how you want to answer that.
Well, quite frankly, I like both of them. I mean, as I might have mentioned, initially, the Locket piece drew me because it was a more recent acquisition to the collection. And the Dial piece, it's never the same until, I mean, when it's in storage versus being out on display. I was worried about the Dial piece for some reason, because I was like, well, I don't know if the two would mesh well together or not on the same wall, because they both have very dominant and prominent features. You can't really tell from this image, but maybe a little bit from the image, the first slide, that the Locket piece is not as flat as it looks on this picture. I mean, neither is the Dial piece, but particularly the Locket piece, it's kind of irregular. It bows out in certain sections. So I wasn't sure if, the power of one would take away the power of the other. But the Dial piece, I mean, it really grew on me after it got on the wall and the light was shining on it. So I think both works, they hold a certain amount of value for me.
Yeah, I think that's something to point out too, that there's so much dimensionality and texture, and in both of these works, I think seeing them, on these images you've pulled for today's talk are great, but seeing them in person is really special. So I would again encourage everybody, if you're in the Athens area, to come check them out in person at the museum. And they're up until the end of November. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Till November 28th, and then we'll move to our next In Dialogue installation. Azalea did clarify, she says no of all of the collection. So not just a favorite. Oh. You have a favorite work of art in the collection?
That is always hard for me to answer.
That's a really
because I guess for me as a curator, it depends on the context. Like if you were to ask me, do you have a favorite work on view in the permanent collection right now? I would say probably these two works. And I mean, and a lot of it is based on like where it's positioned. I mean, they're kind of singled out, they're in their own section. As I mentioned before, one of my concerns was I didn't want to, enmesh some of these works in amongst others and it not get the prominence that, where they could be best appreciated. And I would say that, yeah, it's hard. If you asked me 2 or 3 months ago, I would have, maybe mentioned an Emma Amos work.
Yeah.
But now those pieces are gone.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 other questions. Both are about Bill Arnett. So Tracy asks, she says, thank you so much. Very interesting artists and works. Mr. Dial's work was collected by Bill Arnett. Was Mr. Lockwood's work also collected? I think she meant Mr. Locket.
Locket, yes. So Locket was approached in, kind of in tandem with Thornton Dial. I think that Ronald Locket developed a stronger relationship with Bill Arnett's son, who also is a collector, Paul, because they were about the same age. So based on what I've read, he had deeper conversations with Ronald Locket about his work. So I think from the image that I showed earlier with Thornton Dial and Bill Arnett, those two probably had a closer relationship, whereas Paul, his son, had a closer relationship with Locket. So, Bill Arnett, obviously, as the elder statesman at that time, probably would have had a more dominant, image, there would be more images of him and Thornton Dial than there would have been with his son and Ronald Locket, particularly since Ronald Locket didn't live as long as Thornton Dial did. So.
And then another question about Bill Arnett is from Jean Petrovs, who's one of our longtime docents at the museum. Hi, Jean. And she says, these works go together really well. Has Arnett's reputation been restored over time? He had been derided and thought to have selfishly profited from self-taught artists, particularly Black self-taught artists.
Yeah, I think that, it'll be interesting to think about, since he's passed away, about kind of the legacy of his work, and the foundation continues to work supporting self-taught artists and documenting them. So I think some reparative efforts are underway. It's interesting to kind of look at that whole controversy, because Thornton Dial in particular, I'm not sure about Ronald Locket. I never heard of any commentary with regard to when he was alive, but Thornton Dial, I guess pretty much to the day he died, loved Bill Arnett, and he did not feel as though he was manipulated by him in the way that maybe other artists felt that something had gone awry in some way in terms of negotiation. So Thornton Dial was a big supporter and friend of Arnett. He felt that Arnett supported his career and, made a difference in his life and the life of many of the artists that he befriended and were friends with prior to becoming, pretty famous. So, I think it's one of those things where I guess it's an individual, you have different individuals who felt differently about the circumstances. So,
yeah, and he just passed away last year, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a complicated thing. I think he brought, helped bring awareness in sort of the broader public about a lot of these artists, but yeah, perhaps.
And anything with the politics of the art world, particularly with regard to collecting and purchasing and the art market, it always gets messy. I don't care whether you're a shark or whether you're, the most innocent bystander. There's always a mess because the art market can get heated up so quickly, and it's a mess. So.
Yeah, and like you said, it'll be interesting to see sort of over time how history sort of looks back at his legacy.
I'd like to think that, with individuals like Arnett, and even as in the case of our benefactors, like the Shelps, who've had major exhibition or their works included in major exhibitions over the decades, that the moral to the story is that these works, like many of the materials that they were created out of, would have been forgotten had their reputations not been rescued and elevated through collectors. I don't like to think of artists as being discovered as though they were, out of the wilderness. They're a part of the same world that we're a part of. But I do say that documenting artists through exhibition, sharing the work, is beneficial to us all. So.
Yeah, and providing access to just awareness about artists who otherwise might not have had, like been as sort of widely known and studied and enjoyed. So yeah, sort of goes both ways. Well, if there's no other questions for Shawnya, do you have anything else you want to end with before we wrap things up?
Just to remind everyone to come out and view the 2 works that'll be on display. We just said the date, Callan, and I can't remember it that quickly.
November 28th, so right after Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Weekend after Thanksgiving. And the museum is open. We're open back to our regular opening schedule, 6 days a week. We're open every day except for Monday. Museum's free to visit, and you can book free time tickets on our website if you'd like to do that in advance, or you can just walk up to the desk and they'll check you in. So thank you all so much for joining today. Thank you again, Shawnya.
Thank you.
Hope to see you all at the museum. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.